But where do we go from here? Has King Charles done enough to quell this now?
No, I don't think so.
The Oak Room of Windsor Castle is never a place for fragile souls, but today's high-stakes luncheon, held under the false pretense of celebrating 11-year-old Princess Charlotte's brilliant academic achievements, was in reality a deeply hidden and toxic battlefield. King Charles sat proudly at the absolute center of the long, magnificent table, smiling with a sense of grandfatherly warmth, while Prince William and Princess Kate sat closely to their young daughter, their vigilant demeanor forming an invisible shield of protection around her. However, at the very other end of the table, Queen Camilla sat like an imposing ice statue, completely unable to accept that the entire royal court's attention was being totally eclipsed by a commoner-born girl who happened to hold a prestigious royal title. Without ever resorting to vulgar or obvious scolding, Camilla unleashed a series of razor-sharp psychological attacks, perfectly camouflaged under the deceptive guise of high society etiquette. As Princess Charlotte radiantly and enthusiastically recounted her history essay that had just received a perfect score from her tutors, Camilla deliberately seized the moment to disrupt her, scraping her silver fork incredibly hard against her expensive porcelain plate. The piercing, screeching clash of metal instantly interrupted the innocent child's words, and without even looking at Charlotte, the Queen turned directly to King Charles, dropping a cold, calculated remark that royal children of previous generations were never allowed to boast about personal achievements at a formal dining table. The words were light as a feather but carried an absolute, devastating lethality that caused Charlotte's radiant smile to vanish instantly. The 11-year-old girl shrank her shoulders in visible distress, her small hands gripping the edge of her linen napkin as her confused, tearful eyes desperately sought comfort from her mother. Princess Kate immediately leaned forward, her lips pressed tightly together in sheer indignation, fully ready to speak up and defend her vulnerable child against this blatant bullying. But at that very critical moment, a hand gently touched Kate's arm under the table, firmly holding her back to prevent a scene. It was Carole Middleton's hand, sitting quietly in a corner. The mother with resilient commoner blood had withdrawn into absolute silence, but her sharp, unyielding eyes did not miss a single beat of this cruel hunt. Unlike the diplomatic restraint that bound the Prince and Princess of Wales due to their official positions, Carole saw right through Camilla's malicious strategy to strip the young child of her confidence through constant invalidation. King Charles merely sipped his tea, quickly changing the subject and inadvertently indulging the bully's quiet rampage. Camilla smirked in pure triumph, entirely certain that no one in this room dared to defy the Queen's supreme authority, but little did she know that Carole's razor-sharp gaze had locked onto her, marking the definitive beginning of an uncompromising war. To escape the Queen's needle-like, scrutinizing gaze after the grueling lunch finally ended in an extremely suffocating atmosphere, Charlotte asked her grandfather for permission to step out into the pristine garden right below the Oak Room's high balcony. Just stepping through the clear glass doors and taking a deep breath of fresh air, the young girl finally felt like she could breathe freely, away from the restrictive rules and sharp taunts of the dining hall. Charlotte quickly regained her innate cheerfulness under the shade of the ancient trees, skipping across the damp grass left by last night's heavy rain. She carefully navigated through the dew-soaked rose bushes, picking the reddest, freshest flowers she could find because she innocently wanted to personally bring this beautiful gift up to her grandfather and everyone else, hoping the flower's pure beauty could dispel the earlier coldness and tension. Charlotte clutched the beautiful bouquet tightly to her chest, careful to keep the sharp thorns from scratching her hands, and then awkwardly hurried up the slippery marble steps back to the balcony. But the hasty, carefree nature of a child had left undeniable physical traces on her appearance. Her shiny leather shoes had picked up some dark mud from the wet garden, and a few streaks of murky water from the still dewy flower stems had accidentally brushed against the surface of her pristine white silk dress, leaving faint but clearly visible stains. The moment Charlotte stepped over the balcony threshold, before the radiant, expectant smile on her lips could even fade, her eager eyes searching for her grandfather suddenly froze in sheer terror. Camilla was already standing there, right in the middle of the narrow pathway like a dangerous predator with its net cast, just waiting for the innocent prey to walk directly into the trap. There was no grandmotherly gentleness, nor a single warm inquiry about where the child had just been. Instead, Camilla delivered a direct, vicious, and completely unmasked emotional attack. She stepped forward aggressively, completely blocking the little girl's path, and raised her arm to point a sharp, diamond-studded finger straight at Charlotte's muddy shoes. Her face hardened, every single muscle tense with rage, her eyes revealing extreme disgust and profound contempt for the child's commoner lineage. Camilla used a low, raspy, irritable, and spiteful tone of voice that pierced straight through the child's newly recovered confidence without any regard for the staff around them. She didn't just scold the little girl for getting her clothes dirty. She directly attacked Charlotte's self-esteem and very existence, calling the natural mud stains an unforgivable defilement of the royal palace. She disparaged the stained dress as concrete proof of inferiority in the bloodline, a humiliating disgrace that shamed the entire family name, spitting out every syllable with the precision and malice of someone specialized in destroying the spirits of others. Camilla dragged out the strictest royal standards and rigid dogmas to crush the helpless child who was tightly holding a bouquet of roses meant for love, wanting Charlotte to permanently engrave in her mind that regardless of her title, she would forever be an inferior being unworthy of respect. The psychological attack was so excessively cruel, relentless, and sudden that Charlotte completely collapsed emotionally, her eyes widening in horror as tears streamed down her face in utter panic, while her hands became numb, causing the crimson stems to fall scattered onto the cold, indifferent marble floor where the crushed petals were flattened beneath Camilla's designer shoes. Camilla stood up straight, her arms crossed over her chest as she looked down from above at the child crying breathlessly, the corners of her mouth curling into a cold, deeply satisfied smile because she believed she had finally defeated the pride of the House of Wales. But that vicious triumph did not last long, as Charlotte's panicked sobbing cries tore through the quiet, artificial atmosphere of the room, acting like a bucket of cold water thrown straight at the adults. King Charles stood completely stunned, the teacup in his hand shaking violently, his face showing shock but his feet rooted to the floor by the weakness deeply ingrained in his subconscious. Prince William snapped around immediately, his face replacing its smile with a rigid tension in his jaw, his eyes churning with sparks of fury as he saw his daughter cowering in fear before her step-grandmother. Princess Kate rushed forward, her face pale with heartbreak and indignation, but before William or Kate could even cross the long table to protect their daughter, someone else had already acted faster and more decisively than everyone else in the room. Carole Middleton did not run in a panic. Instead, she took firm, heavy, and murderous steps across the length of the room, her eyes sharper than any sword in the royal armory. Carole was not afraid of the king's presence, nor did she care about the supreme queen status of the person standing in front of her. In this moment, all etiquette and class rules were completely meaningless as the primal instinct to protect her family's flesh and blood eclipsed everything else. Carole stepped straight into the space of power and intimidation that Camilla had just established, completely ignoring the queen as if she were merely an invisible, pathetic obstacle. Carole didn't argue immediately. Her very first action struck directly at the evidence of the conflict as she bent down to the cold marble floor to carefully and reverently pick up every single crushed, mud-stained rose. The hands of the woman who had once built an empire from scratch were slow but full of immense weight, collecting the ruined bouquet in the palm of her hand and gripping the thorny stems tightly as concrete physical evidence of Camilla's cruelty. Immediately after, Carole turned and wrapped her arms tightly around her sobbing granddaughter, patting rhythmically on Charlotte's trembling back to give the little girl a solid, unbreakable anchor. At the same time, Carole used her own body to pivot, creating an absolute physical shield that completely blocked Camilla's disgusted, contemptuous view of the weeping child. The mud-covered bouquet in Carole's hand was no longer a discarded, reviled gift. It had successfully turned into a sharp, undeniable weapon exposing all the base psychological manipulation and petty malice that Camilla had just unleashed on an innocent child. Carole slowly stood up straight, refusing to retreat even half a step, and deliberately closed the distance with Camilla, directly encroaching on the queen's personal safe zone with an air of terrifying defiance. On one side was the queen holding supreme power backed by the throne, accustomed to using intimidation to suppress others, but on the other side was the primal, fierce instinct of a grandmother ready to burn everything down to protect her grandchild. Carole clenched the crushed bouquet tightly, her eyes blazing with deep resentment and unwavering determination as she stared straight into Camilla's starting to waver pupils, completely crushing the queen's fake arrogance with the naked, mud-stained truth in her hands. The continuous and suffocating silence that enveloped the magnificent oak room after Carole Middleton's direct verbal explosion felt heavier than a massive concrete block, so dense that the panicked gasps of the remaining royal court members and high-ranking attendants echoed clearly against the centuries-old walls. Queen Camilla, completely shocked and sensing the very genuine, lethal threat mixed with an absolute protective fury radiating from Carole's unyielding eyes, hurriedly tried to adjust her rigid posture to claw back her rapidly slipping superior authority. The queen lifted her arrogant chin as high as humanly possible, took a sharp breath, and prepared to open her mouth to issue an immediate, crushing order of total expulsion from the castle or deliver a devastating reprimand regarding the sacred royal hierarchy to permanently silence this insolent commoner woman. But Carole Middleton, completely unbothered by the crown or the historical weight of the throne, did not give her enemy even a fraction of a second to utter another venomous or manipulative word. Enough! Carole's deep voice rang out across the vast room, not as a high-pitched, shrill, or hysterical scream, but in a low, terrifyingly steely tone that carried the absolute weight of 1,000 pounds thrown straight into a still, artificial lake. The heavy words came out like an iron command, instantly extinguishing the queen's desperate attempt to raise her voice or exert her royal dominance over the family. Without letting her stunned enemy react or find her footing, Carole raised the crushed, tattered, and heavily mud-stained bouquet of red roses high into the air, thrusting the glaring physical evidence straight toward Camilla's pale face. Carole completely bypassed vague insinuations, hollow diplomatic phrases, or evasive courtesies. Instead, she launched a brutal, direct attack, stating bluntly in an undeniable tone that emphasized every single syllable that Charlotte was only an innocent 11-year-old child, a pure little girl who had simply brought fresh flowers from the beautiful garden to give to her grandfather with all the purity and love in her heart. She declared that the young princess was absolutely not a psychological punching bag, nor a convenient tool for anyone, even the bitter person wearing the supreme crown on her head, to use as a miserable place to vent their cruel tyranny and deeply sinister prejudices. Not stopping at a severe verbal reminder, Carole mercilessly stripped bare Camilla's despicable psychological tactics right in front of the king and the entire gathering of royal elites. She pointed her finger straight at the crushed, ruined petals, publicly accusing the queen's recent behavior not as a noble or necessary correction of royal etiquette, nor a dignified lesson in court manners, but as a disgusting crime of malicious psychological manipulation. She exposed it as a base, wicked, and cowardly act of emotional abuse performed with the sole, targeted purpose of permanently destroying a young child's inner confidence and soul. Every single word uttered from Carole's mouth was like a massive sledgehammer pounding mercilessly, completely shattering the thick mask of fake benevolence and grandmotherly grace that Camilla had always taken immense pains to build for the media. The ugly truth of the queen's bullying behavior was dragged into the blinding light, naked, filthy, and entirely undeniable. Camilla stood rooted to the spot as if her expensive shoes were permanently nailed to the cold marble floor, her face changing continuously from a pale, ghostly white of absolute surprise to a deep, burning red of explosive anger and humiliating disgrace. Her lips trembled violently, and her hands clenched into tight fists. She had never once in her life been stood up to by anyone in this manner, especially not by a commoner woman without a drop of noble title, someone she deeply despised and deemed inferior, who now dared to stand straight and insult her to her face right in the very castle she claimed to rule. Right at that explosive moment, Prince William and Princess Kate stepped tightly to Carole's side, their movements synchronized and powerful. The Prince of Wales did not utter a single word of direct reprimand to his stepmother, but his heavy physical actions were firmer and louder than 10,000 words. William stepped directly to the front, using his tall, imposing body to form a solid, impenetrable fortress wall that completely shielded his mother-in-law and his weeping daughter from any further attacks. Princess Kate stood right behind him, her protective arms tightly wrapping around Charlotte's shaking body, pulling the little girl close to her chest to provide warmth. Kate's eyes, looking directly at Camilla now, held absolutely no shred of traditional royal respect, deference, or fear. There was only the cold, icy, and lethal glare of a mother ready to completely tear apart anyone who dared to touch or hurt her flesh and blood. The defensive wall of the House of Wales had been successfully erected, fortified, united, and completely impenetrable. Backed into a tight corner by this unified front, Camilla spun around in a panic to look at King Charles, her eyes filled with supreme urgency, silent demands, and frantic commands for intervention. She waited for her kingdom's most powerful husband to finally speak up, exert his absolute power, and defend the supreme honor of his queen. She waited for Charles to fly into a massive rage, deliver the harshest possible punishments, and immediately throw these insubordinate, rebellious people out of Windsor Castle forever. But King Charles did not budge a single inch. The king stood there with his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes extremely gloomy, dark, and filled with deep sorrow, completely lacking the courage to look straight at the furious wife who was waiting for his protection. Instead, Charles stared blankly at the crushed, mud-stained bouquet of roses in Carole's tight grip, then shifted his pained, deeply ashamed gaze to the pale, tear-streaked face of his beloved granddaughter huddled fearfully behind her mother. Charles's absolute silence at this critical moment was no longer just a sign of weakness to keep the peace. It was pure, unadulterated shock, a belated and incredibly bitter realization of the profound level of cruelty of the very woman he had chosen to share his life and throne with. No words of defense were offered to the queen, and no royal command to protect her honor was issued. The official banquet had completely and permanently collapsed. The flowery diplomatic covers and the fake, expensive curtains hiding the deep family conflicts had been mercilessly torn away, leaving behind a ruined, humiliating battlefield where the most powerful crowned woman in the country had just taken a fatal psychological ambush, losing all her dignity and face, without any remaining ability to fight back against the truth. The heavy, reinforced door of the black bulletproof royal SUV slammed shut with a deafening thud, completely cutting off the suffocating, toxic, and artificial air of Windsor Castle. The large vehicle glided away silently under the shade of the ancient trees, leaving behind an uncleaned, chaotic emotional battlefield in the oak room. Inside the heavily armored cabin, a dead, absolute silence fell, so incredibly heavy that it made it hard to breathe for everyone inside. There were no more active sobs, only Charlotte's choked, broken, and fragile gasps as the 11-year-old princess curled up tightly on the luxurious leather seat, burying her small, pale face deep into her mother's chest. Kate hugged her daughter with an intense fierceness, her arms tightening as if she wanted to use her own body to completely shield her child from all the dark, outside attacks of the royal world. The Princess of Wales's sharp eyes never left the dried mud stains on the hem of the white silk dress, the physical, undeniable imprint of the vicious humiliation the queen had just inflicted on her baby. Every single stain felt like a sharp knife, slashing directly into a mother's pride and joy. On the opposite leather seat, Carole Middleton sat with a perfectly straight back, maintaining the rigid, unyielding posture of a seasoned general who had just successfully withdrawn from the front lines, but had yet to drop her weapon. On her lap, a gray silk scarf was carefully and tightly folded, wrapping the crushed, tattered, and mud-covered rose petals safely inside. That ruined bouquet was no longer a rejected, dirty gift. It had officially become vital physical evidence, a bloody, undeniable spoil of war from a direct, uncompromised confrontation between a fierce commoner mother and the woman wearing the most powerful crown of the dynasty. Prince William sat tightly next to Carole, the thick darkness inside the moving car obscuring half of the prince's face, but failing to hide the violent churning of the incredibly tense muscles along his jawline. He looked down at his trembling, traumatized daughter, then over at the crushed petals in his mother-in-law's steady hands, his eyes flashing with a cold, terrifyingly sharp look that signaled a point of no return. The legendary patience of the future King of England had completely run out. The very last, thinnest shred of respect he possessed for his calculating stepmother had been torn to bloody pieces along with every single rose petal that had fallen onto the cold marble floor earlier. No discussion took place inside the car during the long drive. There were no nods of compromise, no need for any consensus from royal advisors, and absolutely no orders requested from the palace bureaucracy. William slowly and deliberately pulled his secure, encrypted phone from his heavy coat pocket. He did not call a high-priced lawyer, nor did he resort to the futile intervention of the courts or the public police. In this ruthless, hidden world of high royalty, the most terrifying and effective punishment did not come from steel handcuffs or public trials, but from the absolute, freezing deprivation of privilege and access. William's fingers glided with extreme speed across the illuminated screen, connecting directly to the personal line of the head of the Wales family's private, elite security team. The prince's voice rang out in the confined space of the vehicle, not loud, not shouting, but terrifyingly cold and sharp as a sword just drawn from its sheath for execution. "Listen carefully," William said. "From this very moment on, I am officially issuing an absolute, non-negotiable no-approach order against the Queen. The entire private living area, the private classrooms, and the personal space of the 3 Wales children are now an absolute no-go zone." He paused for a single beat, his dark eyes glued to Charlotte's small, vulnerable silhouette, then emphasized every single word with chilling finality. "Any member of the Queen's personal retinue, and Queen Camilla herself, if they appear within a 20-meter radius around any of the children without the direct, physical presence of myself or the princess, are to be stopped immediately by any means necessary. There are no exceptions, and no prior reporting to the king is needed. Execute this order immediately." The other end of the secure line gave only a terse, formal confirmation of absolute, unquestioning obedience before the call ended in less than 20 seconds. William quietly put away his phone and looked up at Kate. Their eyes met in the darkness of the armored vehicle, transmitting a silent but ruthlessly resolute message that the steel wall had been permanently erected and the toxic enemy was locked outside. The very next morning, deep within the private office located in the heavily guarded east wing of Windsor Castle, the air was so chillingly quiet that one could clearly hear the faint, rhythmic crackle of burning charcoal in the marble fireplace. Queen Camilla sat leisurely in her favorite crimson velvet-upholstered chair, her legs crossed elegantly as she held a hot porcelain cup of premium Earl Grey tea. The corner of her mouth still held a prominent half-smile, a toxic mix of supreme royal arrogance and vicious, calculated triumph. She was entirely certain that she had won this historic standoff, even though she had been forcefully stood up to in front of her husband the previous afternoon. In Camilla's sinister and deeply manipulative mind, she firmly believed that Carole Middleton's unprecedented insolence was a bloody, suicidal blow to the Middleton family's standing. A commoner woman daring to loudly insult the reigning queen, daring to point trashy, mud-stained evidence right in the ruler's face directly in front of the king. To Camilla, that was an unforgivable, treasonous insult to royal authority that would demand immediate banishment. The queen was just waiting, leisurely taking a slow sip of her warm tea with her eyes glued to the solid gold-plated phone sitting quietly on the desk. She waited for it to ring, fully expecting King Charles to walk through the heavy doors bringing the punishing news that the entire Middleton family had been permanently stripped of all royal access and privileges. She fantasized that the Wales children would from now on be subjected to strict, rigid education under her own harsh hands to bend them back into proper royal shape. Camilla's gaze swept over the phone as the hours ticked away. It was past noon, but the device remained completely silent, stone-cold, and unresponsive. She had absolutely no idea that dozens of miles away, at the private and quiet Middleton residence in the peaceful countryside of Bucklebury, a high-level call had indeed been connected, but the reality on the other end of the line was not a ruthless banishment order as she was foolishly fantasizing. Carole Middleton stood in her spacious living room flooded with natural light, where on the oak table sat a magnificent crystal vase filled with freshly cut, radiant and flawless roses from her own home garden. Charlotte's muddy leather shoes from yesterday had already been cleaned and tucked deep inside a closed closet away from sight. The private phone in Carole's hand was ringing, the screen displaying a top-level security clearance code reserved exclusively for the king heading the royal family. Carole took a deep breath and answered the call calmly, her demeanor unflinching, steady, and without a single trace of fear or anxiety of someone about to face punishment. "Carole." The voice came from the other end of the line, but it was not the authoritative, distant, or angry tone of a king delivering a royal sentence. Instead, it was a low voice filled with immense physical exhaustion and a profound sense of compromise, coming from a man who had just fully realized the staggering level of cruelty of the very woman he shared a bed with. King Charles offered no flowery words of cover-up, nor any long, fake diplomatic greetings. He got straight to the painful core of the matter. He did not issue any punishment or reprimand for Carole's fierce insubordination yesterday. On the contrary, the most powerful man in England was personally lowering his shield over the secure phone line. "I owe you an apology," Charles said slowly, each word uttered carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of genuine remorse on behalf of the terrible things that had taken place in the Oak Room and on behalf of Charlotte's panicked tears. "You were absolutely right to act the way you did. The children needed their safety and emotional well-being protected, and I stood there and completely failed to do that." Charles did not even need to name his wife directly. His raw admission of his own failure was the most cruel, definitive death sentence for the Queen's remaining power in this family war. King Charles had officially cast aside his long-standing blindness, completely turning his back on Camilla to stand firmly with the Wales family and the fierce grandmother who had thrown herself into the fire to protect the royal bloodline. All of Camilla's elaborate schemes to use her supreme authority to crush and psychologically abuse the Middletons had completely crumbled into worthless ash. The one who was truly betrayed, the one who was totally abandoned by the throne, was none other than the arrogant woman sitting and harboring empty illusions of power in the East Wing of Windsor. Later that same afternoon, the sharp sound of leather heels tapped rhythmically, heavy and cold against the crimson-carpeted corridor leading straight to the Queen's private office. The massive oak door was pushed violently open without any warning knock, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the room. Camilla started, looking up from her half-read book, and a triumphant smile immediately blossomed on her lips when she saw King Charles enter the room. Finally, the exact moment she had been greedily waiting for had arrived. Camilla stood up abruptly, smoothing the creases of her silk dress and lifting her chin high, fully ready to receive the news of her enemy's humiliating downfall. "Charles, you have finally arrived," Camilla spoke up, deliberately drawing out the syllables with a voice full of immense satisfaction and condescension. "Have you finished dealing with those insolent people? That undisciplined 11-year-old child and her commoner grandmother must pay the ultimate price for their actions." But Camilla's venomous words choked instantly in her throat. Charles stepped into the middle of the room as the heavy door behind him slowly slammed shut, locking the two of them in a closed, suffocating, and terrifying space. The king did not smile, nor did he open his arms to approach and kiss or comfort her as he usually did. Charles stood rooted to the spot exactly 3 steps away from her, his eyes, which normally always held unconditional tolerance, blindness, and soft indulgence for Camilla, had now completely changed. At the bottom of his eyes, there was only a dull gray, cold, empty, and deeply alienated look. He stared at the crowned woman in front of him, his gaze as sharp as a scalpel stripping away all the base, petty, and malicious psychological schemes she always tried to hide beneath her luxurious royal exterior. Not a single word was uttered by the monarch, not a single angry shout, Not a single explanation, and no argument took place. Charles's absolute, dead silence fell like a giant boulder weighing heavily on Camilla's chest, suffocating all her inflating illusions of power. The smug smile on Camilla's lips froze, distorted, and then gradually shattered into pathetic pieces. She took a fearful step back, her hands gripping the wooden armrest of the chair as her eyes began to panic, frantically searching every facial feature of her husband for a sign of hope. For the first time since stepping into the royal family, Camilla felt a profound, primal terror, a chilling dread running down her spine and seeping deep into her marrow. She suddenly realized that her greatest protective shield, the supreme power of her life, had been brutally and permanently revoked. Charles, Camilla's voice trembled violently, her arrogant, bossy demeanor from earlier completely evaporating, leaving behind a terrified, rapidly aging woman. But the king still did not answer her. He could not even be bothered to open his mouth to the one who had heartlessly destroyed his granddaughter's joy. He only looked at her with the cold eyes of someone looking at a completely invisible person, someone who had personally taken a knife and severed all emotional blood ties with the rest of the family. Charles turned sharply on his heel, shifting his weight and turning his back on the queen without bothering to cast a single lingering glance or show a drop of pity. The king strode out of the room, leaving only the echoing sound of his heels striking the stone floor as the door slammed shut, echoing dryly in the large, empty room. The most cruel and effective punishment had been executed without a single drop of public drama. No police stormed into the castle, and there was no dramatic dragging or kicking her out of the palace for the paparazzi to weave lucrative stories about. Camilla still kept the glittering crown on her head, and she was still legally allowed to stay in the most luxurious, expensive rooms of the historic castle, but she had permanently become a living ghost within her own home. All actual power, all social dominance over the Wales family, and all access to the future generation had been blatantly and entirely stripped away from her grasp. She was locked in her own ultimate, golden isolation, facing cold, indifferent palace walls that no member of her family would ever want to step past to visit or show respect to. At the exact same time, in a completely different, light-filled space in the sun-drenched garden of the Bucklebury estate, Princess Charlotte was laughing heartily. The 11-year-old girl had changed into a brand-new, comfortable dress, running, jumping, and playfully chasing her pet dog across the lush, vibrant green grass. The utter panic and emotional trauma of yesterday had been wiped away without a single trace, replaced entirely by absolute freedom, safety, and inner peace. Carole Middleton stood on the wide wooden porch, holding a warm cup of tea as her gentle, steady, and protective eyes followed every joyful stride of her granddaughter. Inside the house, the silk scarf that had contained the crushed rose petals had been thrown straight into the trash, replaced on the tables by radiant, fragrant, and living flowers. The dirt-stained shoes had been completely scrubbed clean and neatly put away in the corner of the closet, waiting for the proper day to step out into the big wide world with the little girl. The cruel person full of base malice had been completely stripped of her weapons and banished to an eternal, freezing silence, right on her own stolen throne. The protectors, through pure instinct, unity, and determination, had won a glorious and permanent victory for their family. The steel boundary had been clearly and definitively defined. There would be no forgiveness, no fake handshakes of reconciliation, and no diplomatic compromise. The absolute justice of family love had struck down with the quietest, most devastating punishment, permanently crushing all the hypocrisy, bullying, and cruelty of toxic royal power.